I think it's really important to note that the NSTA, the Next Generation Science Standards, have tried to make it, as it seems abundantly clear, that these are performance expectations, not curriculum. But I think the same trap, teachers may fall into the same trap with, as they might with Common Core, to think it's a curriculum. And so how do we get teachers to not just focus on the DCI?
Well, let me jump in and talk about advice to teachers here in Kentucky, since it's kind of a Kentucky thing. We've been really deliberate about making the point that you can't use what we're calling the folder swap or the crosswalk mentality, which is that you can't just simply say, okay, so here's my weather unit that used to be in 3rd grade, and now it's, you know, it's in grade X, but now it's moved to grade Y. So I'll trade you my weather unit for your simple machines unit, and it's just business as usual. One of the things that we really try to point out is the fact that the crosswalk really ends up being just sort of a topic match as compared to the old standards, and so therefore you run that very risk. And we have very much resisted the call to produce a crosswalk, and if somebody ever forces me to, it's going to be a document with 2 essentially empty columns and a 3rd one that's got the topics, because we really need to make the point that the standards have the cross-cutting concepts and the science and engineering practices equal to content. And I hate to sound mercenary, but in some ways this will end up being sort of a self-correcting problem, because eventually there will be a test. And we all know that instruction, or at least school practice around instruction, tends to react to the test. And the first time people encounter a test that assesses the cross-cutting concepts and the science and engineering practices, the message will finally get out there, holy cow, we can't just do the content. Sadly, I hope there will always be a handful of people, I think, who don't believe, hey, they weren't really serious about that stuff. It's still just the orange box in the middle. But and sadly, I think those people will find themselves way behind the 8 ball then when they encounter the first assessment and realize, hey, they really are making an effort to assess all of the standards and not just the more familiar content part. So I think eventually the assessment itself will try to correct that problem. But in the intervening years, we are just trying to be very deliberate about making the point that when the assessment comes, it will be about the other stuff. And so the tack that we've taken in working with our teacher networks is to start the transition from old to new by not even really worrying so much about the DCIs, but focusing on incorporating science and engineering practices into the current content, so that teachers sort of get their feet wet on the practices within the context of the content they're more familiar with now. So that's the major approach we're taking.
One of the appendices of the NGSS talks about the shifts, and they are very different standards, as we just heard a little bit before from our panelists. And one of those reasons is because we have that integration between the practices and the disciplinary core ideas. So if the students are meeting the performance expectations, they have to be doing practices. We can't just do the disciplinary core ideas. Another shift that I don't think is talked about quite as much is that we're really expecting these standards of all students, and this includes at the high school level, not just that the students who would normally take physics and chemistry are now taking physics and chemistry, but the NGSS performance expectations. The NGSS performance expectations are for all students, and they don't replace any course standards. So states have the option to add those, but we're saying now that all students are expected to know some deep chemistry and physics and biology and earth science before they graduate.
To get back to your question, and thanks, Jennifer, for doing the shifts part. That you did it much better than I would have. One of the question you asked about how does performance assessment, or how does the idea of performance standards not get lost? I think one of the ways that happens is through the engineering design and the integrated engineering standards, because people who aren't really familiar with the standards should go through and look, and you'll notice that the ones with an asterisk at the end are the ones that integrate the expectations from engineering. Many of those when you start looking at them in terms of the Stiggins model of deconstructing them into knowledge standards, skill, reasoning, and product or performance standards, a lot of those imply a performance target. In order to fully meet the intent of those integrated engineering standards, students are going to be expected to do something that really only can be assessed in terms of a performance assessment, and so that implies in performance on the part of the student. And I think that those engineering integration standards are a place where we can start getting used to this idea of performance-based instruction, because there's going to have to be performance-based instruction around those standards. Otherwise, you can't say that your students have met them.
Yeah, and as I work with teachers on project-based learning, which is again that authentic and performance-based assessment, there's a lot of a big instructional shift there that it takes. It's really a different perspective than a lot of teachers I think have been used to. So it's certainly going to take a lot of work, a lot of training.